The Abuja Proclamation, adopted at the first Pan-African Conference on Reparations in Nigeria in April of 1993, celebrated its 30th anniversary this week. The document underscored the need to undo the harm caused by centuries of slave labor and a century of colonial exploitation by Western nations. And the question remains in 2023, how can European countries undo the damage left in Africa, the Caribbean and the Americas, which are struggling with heavy debt, disease and deadly conflicts? We're now joined to unpack the declaration by Senior Research Fellow at the University of Pretoria Center for Advancement of Scholarship, Professor Adekeye Adebajo. Thank you very much, Prof, for your time this morning. Let's start with some of the main arguments of the proclamation.
Yes, thank you very much. The main arguments of the proclamation are basically Africa suffered from 4 centuries of slavery and unpaid labor, and the depopulation of the continent also, and then a century of colonialism where the continent was exploited by European nations. Second issue that the Abuja Proclamation made was that other victims historically of crimes like these, crimes against humanity, have actually been compensated. So, for example, the Jewish population, which suffered the Nazi Holocaust, received $60 billion in compensation, approximately. Japanese Americans who were interned during the Second World War as a result of U.S. policy of the Roosevelt administration were compensated $1.2 million. So those are really the main arguments that the proclamation is making, plus African artifacts also being returned to Africa. So there's a political, economic and cultural dimension to these demands.
You've got the prophets of Abuja being Ali Mazrui, Ade Ajayi and Moshood Abiola, and essentially they proposed 4 concrete acts of restitution, the first being Western material and moral support to democracy in Africa, the second being Western reduction or elimination of economic impediments to Africa's development, the third assisting Africa to overcome social cultural obstacles and democratization, and the fourth capital transfers from the West to Africa, being the Middle Passage Plan. All concrete ideas. What then has since happened?
These ideas were Ali Mazrui, not the other 3 prophets. It's just Ali Mazrui proposing these particular 4 ideas. You haven't seen much as a result of this. The only countries that seem to have moved, Germany in 2021 agreed with the Namibian government to transfer 1.1 billion euros over 30 years to the Namibian government for restitution for the German genocide that happened in Southwest Africa between 1904 and 1908. But there are Herero and Nama groups who objected to having not been directly consulted and negotiated with. So this has not been implemented yet. And more recently, in December 2022, you had the Dutch government and Mark Rutte, who is himself a historian, the Prime Minister, basically apologize for and acknowledge the harm of Dutch slavery around the world and set up a 200 million euro fund to basically raise awareness and try to tackle the continuing impact of these crimes. So there has been some movement in that regard, and in terms of artifacts being returned, you've recently seen the governments of France, Britain, Germany making moves to return African artifacts to their rightful owners. So there has been movement in that regard. But in terms of transforming institutions of global governance like the World Bank, the IMF, and giving Africa a seat on the UN Security Council, a permanent seat, that is, that hasn't happened yet, though the UN has come out in favor of an African and Latin American permanency of the Security Council.
What has happened of Wole Soyinka's insistence that looted wealth of African autocrats like Zaire's Mobutu Sese Seko and Nigeria's General Ibrahim Babangida and Sani Abacha be returned to the continent as a form of internal moral cleansing?
Well, Sani Abacha's looted wealth, as you know, was returned by Swiss authorities. I think there was at least $1 billion that was returned by the Swiss government after his death in 1998. It took a while and quite a bit of negotiation, but some of that wealth, or much of it, was returned to the Nigerian government. In terms of the others, I don't think that we've seen anything officially in terms of that wealth.
You ask a question of how European nations who enslaved and colonized African people for nearly 5 centuries can repair the damage that has been left on the continent, not only in the form of reparations as we have been speaking about it, but what does that look like to you? And when the monies come back, when the looted African art comes back, who then manages that efficiently, as we have seen on the continent, sometimes being plagued by things not going so well with monies being pocketed?
I don't think that's really I think that's a false argument, actually. I think if you've had wealth that has been stolen, then that needs to be returned. And that's really the primary concern here. It's not whether it's going to be well managed. Of course, we would like art and money to be well managed and for it to be distributed, and so that restitution can actually happen and past victims can actually benefit from these monies. But I think the main argument that we're making here is that there has to first be an acknowledgement of the crimes that have happened, because, as I noted, countries like Britain, France, Portugal, Belgium, who were some of the most egregious, if you like, perpetrators of crimes against humanity in places like Algeria, which suffered 1 million deaths during its civil war against France, during its war of independence, against France between 1954 and 1962, and Belgium accused of 10 million deaths in terms of forced labor on rubber plantations during the rule of King Leopold after the 1880s, or Britain during the Mau Mau struggle in the 50s, where 25,000 people were killed and over 100,000 detained in camps without any trial. Those are the kinds of things we need compensation for. I don't think the argument should really be whether they're going to be managed or whether African governments are corrupt.
What then do you say to somebody that says, well, you characterize them as crimes against humanity? Has there been any justice, in particular when you take a look at institutions such as the International Criminal Court, for instance?
I think that's another argument completely. The International Criminal Court is trying contemporary crimes. And as you know, many people feel that the court is a political court because there are countries that are not part of it, the US, China, and Russia, who sit in judgment of the United Nations Security Council. We're talking here about historical crimes, and many of these crimes are increasingly being recognized now as crimes against humanity. I've noted the recognition and apologies of the German and Dutch government. There was a World Summit on Racism in 2001 in which slavery was recognized as a crime against humanity. So I wouldn't want us to mix up two very different processes.
What do the next 30 years look like of the quest to reparations, or quest for reparations?
I I would hope that you would have more countries come on board, former colonial countries like Britain, like France, like Portugal, like Spain, like Sweden, and like Denmark, and actually acknowledge their role in slavery over three to four centuries, and actually take measures to repair that. And I think if we start seeing some of those norms being established, then it will give rise to a much fairer world, hopefully, and global efforts to tackle slavery, not just in Africa, but in places like the Americas and the Caribbean, would also get a boost from that. But it's a long struggle, as I noted, and these struggles do take a long time. It took a long time to abolish slavery itself. So it is going to take a while to get restitution for some of these crimes against humanity.
Research Fellow at the University of Pretoria Center for the Advancement of Scholarship, Professor Adekeye Adebajo. Thank you very much for your time this morning.